Should we hover up and give the audience a bit of a sense of the overall scope of this project? And I guess it's a project that still feels very much in process,
Yeah.
and in some ways, I guess, had its beginnings with installation work called The Hauntings.
Yeah, which was done in 2010 when I adapted for an installation at the brand new Bell Lightbox building. It's the facility where the Toronto Film Festival takes place. And Noah Cowan, one of the longtime programmer at TIFF, the Toronto Festival, and he was in charge of building the brand new Lightbox. I was telling him how I wanted to make internet art involving lost film adaptations. And he just sort of said, what I love about Noah is he'll say things and then he'll correct himself later. He reversed himself later, but he speaks so quickly and hilariously and tastelessly. And he just said, art on the internet's impossible. And it instantly reminded me of the way people dismissed film 100 years earlier, that the little things watched in moviola boxes weren't art. They were just product gimmicks and things. And so it seemed to me that I made a bet with him that I could make some art. It might not be good art, but it would be art on the internet. And so I started then and I also thought my very slender demographic of the movie-going public could be reached more effectively on the internet, that everyone, maybe even everyone online in the world who might be sympathetic to what I'm trying to do could be reached if I did it on the internet. But I also wanted to keep one foot in feature filmmaking and stuff. So I started this project that seemed to have no possible life as a feature film anyway. The idea of adapting as short movies, one lost movie after another. Now I discovered a motherlode of plot synopses and inspirations in the world of lost film. Almost every country in the world in the first decade of the history of the art form, film, the motion picture camera was invented in 1894. In the first decade and a bit, almost every country had somebody who bought a camera from the Lumiere brothers or from Edison and was making movies. And all that stuff started getting lost almost about as quickly as it got made. And then in the decade that followed that, a lot of directors emerged making narrative movies. And a lot of those, they were adapting really interesting materials, or they were working in really long-forgotten political environments or socioeconomic environments that briefly made a really high percentage of the early filmmakers were women for a while before men pushed them out of the way again for a few decades.
Quite a few decades.
Yes, yes. And a lot of films were made initially by marginalized people. But what interested me more were the films that weren't made by marginalized people, and I started to consider films that were unrealized projects as lost, because really it's the same thing. If a film is made by someone like Oscar Michaud, an African-American who had to sell Bibles door to door and work as a Pullman porter to finance a low-budget film, and then because he couldn't afford to store the film properly, or no one even knew how to store film properly, the film got lost. It's really the same as other aspiring filmmakers, and a lot of his films were lost, tragically, that a lot of, say, Native American filmmakers just didn't get to make films. There was a guy, James Young Deere, who ended up making films in London, but he passed himself off as a Native American, which was still made it hard enough. But a lot of people theorize he was African American, passing himself off as Native American, so just give himself enough leverage to make movies. And there was just so many. I just discovered there were movies made by blacklisted people, or movies repressed before they were made by, under the American blacklist. There were pro-Nazi films, an unrealized Leni Riefenstahl film, which we didn't realize yet, or might not. It's based on a Heinrich Kleist play, Penthesilea. There are anti-Nazi propaganda films, pro-Stalinist films. The anti-Stalinist films tended to be lost very quickly, and their filmmakers were lost even as well. Lost Yiddish films made in New York, lost Yiddish films made in Poland, where almost the entire country was lost along with the films. I don't know, it was really fascinating. Film, you know, the first feature film made by a Bolivian woman in, 1922 or something. They were just, and what shocked me was that how many, that I was so ignorant, as most people are about that era, that the Philippines had a huge film industry, a lot of vampire movies, the aswang. And but that at one point 100% of all Philippine silent films were lost, and then a couple have been found, and that a really high percentage, way more than the 80% of American narrative films from the first 3.5 decades of the art form were lost. But it's about at 98% in Japan, a country you think of as having a rich filmic history, and China, and even the Soviet Union, a very high percentage. So, but with a little bit of research, and I'm an obsessive dilettante. I did a lot of research, but it wasn't organized, it wasn't scholarly. I just started poking around and finding really interesting subjects. There were lost films written by John Wilkes Booth, Lincoln's assassin, by his niece. I don't know, there's odd things, and like, why would they be lost? It's part of the Kennedy conspiracy theory, I'm sure, but there was always something interesting that made me want to, I guess I got megalomaniacal. I actually started to confuse myself with some sort of creator, like with a capital C. I started to think, well, there's a film I'd like to see, so I'll make it. There's a lost film that needs to be reclaimed for history. I'll make it, and it became kind of crazy. And I mostly knew I wasn't anything special, but it just made the list very long, and I made a list at least 200 films long that I wanted to make. But I knew I only had, at one point the project called for 100 shooting days, but I only got to 32. So I started to combine films, and I mentioned one mashup last night that I mentioned in the Q&A was one of Never the Twain, the story of a man possessed by the spirit of Mark Twain while visiting the 1974 Miss Nude World pageant. I wanted to mash that up with a lost Euripides play, Hypsipyle, about a lot of women that have had it with patriarchy and just slaughter all the men, and mash that up with the camera used by Michael Snow to shoot the lost portion of Le Région Centrale, a camera that shoots in any direction. And so you'd actually stage this really carefully choreographed slaughter by naked women of men, but the camera might not even shoot it. It might shoot it in another direction. I was just determined to do that. And so the more I started mashing things up, the more fun. There were a lot of Canadian tax shelter movies that are lost. This was exactly like out of the Mel Brooks movie, The Producers, where the idea was to lose money on the movie, and through some bookkeeping, you could actually make a fortune. Just the more money you lost, the more money you'd make. And so there was a lost tax shelter movie called Creature of Comfort. It's just about a blanket that when it's supposed to be keeping people warm, eats them instead. And there was one called The Electric Hump, about an electrified hump, that if you tried to rub a hunchback's hump for good luck, you would be fatally electrocuted. And these are lost?
Guy, where are you finding this stuff?
Yeah. Well, I'd find them, sometimes I'd find, an anonymous source, kind of a deep throat sort of guy would come to me in the shadows and whisper, electric hump, or something like that. And I go, okay, fine, I'm on it. And but I did accumulate a lot, and I started folding them in on each other. And as one city after another, at one point we were going to shoot for 5 weeks in the atrium of MoMA, where Marina Abramovich sort of owned it, but I was going to go in there and pee all over it with my project, and but that collapsed under its own weight. It was just Canadians aren't used to raising private money. Canadians are used to filling out grant applications and things. I didn't know what to do in America, and so it collapsed. So, but I'd been saving all my best titles for there, and I know at one point we were hoping to adapt here. Hitchcock's Lost the Mountain Eagle, his first feature, and I really still do want to make it sometime. I have my own script, but
now you've blown our cover, because we were actually planning for Guy to make the Mountain Eagle and not actually declare it as Guy's film, but
Right.
declare it that the BFI had found Hitchcock's
Exactly.
Lost, The Mountain Eagle,
Well,
and then present Guy's film.
We may still, yeah.
So,
And then
but now we've blown it.
well, I feel
Our
bad.
grand
I'll just
hopes.
lose it now.
So, but this is moving more now towards the seances project, but with the how. So
yeah, all that stuff was supposed to be uploaded to the internet, a site hosted by the National Film Board of Canada called Seances. Anyone online could visit. The program would combine fragments of all my adaptations, shot in public at the Pompidou, at the Phi Centre in Montreal. Not at MoMA, not at the BFI, alas, not at Sao Paulo. But we shot enough. We shot hundreds of hours of fine-cut footage. The Seances website was going to recombine them into endless permutations, collisions, addled completely by non sequitur. But sometimes they would play because they're planned to kind of play together as units, and sometimes be boring and probably very so abortable as someone visiting the website. But and then that unique combination would be destroyed. So it would produce movies out of lost matter and then return them to the realm of the lost in one visit. And I was excited about that. There just wasn't enough money to make the website. It's costly. It's a film shoot, but not just a film shoot. It's countless films being shot. And so I had to apply for feature film funding and make a feature film, which turned out to be The Forbidden Room. And I'm very proud of The Forbidden Room, and I love making it, and I loved it like a child, just the way I loved seances. So those are my two offspring, and I love them equally. But they're companions, and I hope they can survive a while.
Likewise. Should we have a look at a couple of the hauntings? We've got.
Oh, right, yeah.
We've got Bella and Bing here, as well as Sinclair.
Yeah, these are kind of odd. So I was commissioned to haunt. I'm sorry, I'm all over the place. I was commissioned by Noah Cowan to haunt, not on the internet, but to haunt the brand new Bell Lightbox building. It was brand new. It still smelled like, like new car interior. You could smell the rug glue, and the bathroom still smelled great. And so I told him I'll haunt it by taking lost movies. This is the very germ of the project. Yeah. Lost movies, and adapt them, and we can project them in installation loops. But so I did take a lost Mitsuguchi film called Out of College, and a lost Fritz Lang movie called Lilith and Lee, and a few others. But I also took a couple of things that just felt like losses, and they weren't films, lost films remade. Bing and Bella is just a project I'd wanted to make for a long time. It's about this weird fact I learned that two of my favorite pop performers of the 20th century, Bing Crosby and Bela Lugosi, are buried side by side. And I'd always read about probably the publicist-generated myth of the woman in black who would visit Rudolph Valentino's grave every Halloween or the anniversary of his death or whatever, and just mourn in black veils and put a flower on his grave and disappear. I think it was something, paid for by the Valentino Trust Fund or something like that. I'm not too sure. But I thought, what if I showed up at the graves of Bing and Bella? I wouldn't know who to mourn more. And so I thought maybe at one point when I first found myself in Hollywood, I hired a woman to meet me at the Culver City Cemetery where they're buried, and to just play for my camera the indecision between whose grave to throw yourself on and weep. But I didn't count on LA traffic, and I just set out one Friday afternoon, and we missed each other, and I never did meet her. And my camera remained she's still there, just tossing herself back and forth. So I ended up simulating a Hollywood cemetery just through some slides I downloaded off the internet and some sod I brought indoors, and just shot it in Winnipeg. And Sinclair is another loss. It's really just an important political event. There's In Canada, native Canadians, native Indians, Aboriginal people really are the targets of the most horrific racism, and they're slipping through the system horribly. And there's this one famous case in Winnipeg involving Brian Sinclair, who's a double amputee at the legs, who sat in a waiting room with a very treatable but serious bladder puncture. And he just waited for 33 hours and before someone discovered that he had died somewhere during that 33 hours. And so I probably should have made, since it was an installation loop, I probably should have made it 33 hours long. Maybe that would be a number, but I just randomly, I think it's 3 minutes long. It's just a camera, a cheap-ass version of that Michael Snow camera, just kind of ignoring him more than anything. So it's a species of loss. I was hoping with all the different types of loss on this project to start making a shape the way W.G. Sebald did with his novel Austerlitz, by walking around Auschwitz, leaving an Auschwitz shape hanging in the air. Yeah, I forgot. Back then I was embarked on some almost like Abel-Gance Napoleonic kind of megalomaniacal vision quest to shoot. I was determined to I wasn't even ready. I haven't even come close to mastering making one feature film, but I decided to shoot 100 lost movies without having any scripts. I just had the titles. And so they were shot, it's not surprising that was shot without a script, but I was shooting 10 a day. And they were all terrible, most of them. But the next one was shot just right after. And so it's just a matter of, I'd have a synopsis just from Wikipedia. This is in 2010, before I started on the Seances project. I just sort of had my ego adjusted. I don't know what, by the failure to produce anything watchable, really. I don't mind that as a little whatnot, as part of an 11-panel installation. And then same with Sinclair, because they do mean something to me, especially Sinclair. But I did shoot a lot of movies, 10 movies a day for a couple weeks.
But is that also part of you, actually working in a sort of process-driven way, where you're working to find the piece of work in a sense? Yeah,
and also to encourage. I was really scared about digital filmmaking, which this was, because I'd really learned how to count on happy accidents in the analog world. In the film world, there'd be overexposures or underexposures, or some sprockets would jump, and I don't know, there'd be odd chemical laboratory accidents, and I really learned to go with them. And then what scared me about working in this transition to digital, that I wouldn't find any accidents, that I'd have to make them by being more reckless. So I just took on the idea of not just finding, but it was really hard was to make more than one movie in a day, not because of the time spent on it, but it was just starting at the beginning of a new movie and just shifting gears. And by the end of the day, I didn't even remember what movie I was supposed to be making, and didn't feel like making one, and things like that. So it was really crazy how reckless I got, and so I got very little out of it, other than a stern reminder that you do have to prepare something to make a movie. I wanted this realm of the lost to be colorblind and gender blind and age blind. And Sinclair was a native Canadian, and the guy sort of sitting in a chair in this movie is native. But that's a coincidence, because I just was going to just take anyone, but my camera assistant, who was native, just said, "Hey, can I be in this one?" And I thought for a second, and I want this to be colorblind. And then I went, but it's okay to be native, playing a native. Don't have to be white to play a native. I don't know. So anyway, he's by coincidence, he's native.
I mean, what's really interesting for me seeing this one of the seances is that you're working in a very formal way, actually, in terms of the idea of the spirit as well, and this idea of channeling spirits is very much at the center of the sort of next step of the project, really, which
Yeah.
is the idea of these staging of happenings, of seances.
Yeah, good old-fashioned
in the foyers of major
ectoplasm,
arts
yeah.
institutions. So, how did you get from this point, I guess, to
Yeah.
the
This,
bigger
which was
idea?
very privately made. I thought I'd made a couple movies that had live elements. You hosted one of them, my movie, My Winnipeg. I narrated it live, like a travelogue, and that way I could tell if the audience was falling asleep to energize it, or even direct some of my words directly at the person who was yawning, you know. Or if someone was getting up to go to the bathroom, I could fix them with a stare, which meant, you better just be going to the bathroom. You better be coming back. Why are you wearing a coat? To go to the bathroom, that sort of thing. So I could keep walkouts down by being a showman, you know. And I also had a movie, Brand Upon the Brain, which had a live orchestra, sometimes
Foley
11
artists,
people,
yeah.
sometimes 33 live Foley artists. Really boredom insurance, because it's really fun to watch sound effects being made. A narrator, a singer, a castrato. Yet, and then some other bells and whistles I can't even remember, and rotating narrators. Lou Reed narrated the movie and fell asleep halfway through, and couldn't be awakened. I don't know, all sorts of wild elements that were kind of just made me feel like a showman for the first time. Before that, I'd been a filmmaker. Now I was a filmmaker while shooting and a showman while presenting. But I thought while shooting in public, maybe I would be a showman while shooting. And now I'm not a showman. I don't know what I am, but it made me feel more like a showman. And the conceit of the project was that, well, lost films are films with no known final resting place. They're unhappy spirits doomed to wander the landscape of film history, unable to project themselves for people that might enjoy them. And so it conjures up all sorts of spiritual imagery when you think of it in those terms. And I just thought it would be fun to collect actors together around a table, just like in the corny old seances you see in movies, led by a spiritualist, a medium of some sort, and invite the spirit of a lost film, a specific one, to come down and possess the actors. The actors I put the actors into a trance, which is really easy. Actors just live in a trance anyway. And they're really open to suggestion. So I'd invite the spirit to come down and possess them, and then compel them in this kind of trance state to be uninhibited enough to act out, compel them to act out the lineaments, the patterns of these long forgotten plots. And then I would just be a spirit photographer and just photograph the outcome of these sort of somnambulating performers, and I'd encourage them to loosen up and give some sort of performance. Anyway, it was a conceit, so I started each day at the unseancey hour of noon at the Centre Pompidou, just in the foyer where anyone could come and watch, and put people in a trance, made a great show of it, and then film sets are so slow and so boring for visitors. I remember very well the first time I visited a set. I was an extra. I got made up at 5 in the morning, sat in a green room for 18 hours and got sent home. And then the next day, same thing, got made up at 5 in the morning, sat in a green room for 7 hours, and then walked with a clipboard past Ellen Burstyn 5 times and then got sent home. I don't know, it was boring, and you couldn't tell who the director was.
Boring walking past Ellen Bernstein.
No, that was not boring. But the waiting, you know, was, so I vowed then if I ever made films, I would make them faster just so I wouldn't bore my actors and my crew or myself. But now I had people just wandering up, and I wanted to keep them watching, and I thought maybe I will, you know, if the actual act of making a movie is saturated right from the get-go with a bit of showmanship, that maybe the energy would make itself onto the screen. I've learned that there's no relationship between the amount of energy and showmanship you put into the actual shooting and the finished product. If anything, it's probably just harmful to the project, but it made it bearable for me to get through the shooting process. But it was a great conceit because it informed all the performances. People were uninhibited conduits of spirits, they told themselves. And so I didn't have to direct them. They read the script that we'd written in adaptation of some lost movie, and they just gave themselves over to it in a kind of a trancy state or an uninhibited state. Very melodramatic. Good melodrama is, the truth uninhibited, and that's what the actors gave me, and I liked it. It was a species of realism, but it's a dream realism. It's an uninhibited, like in your dreams when you're allowed to cry without anyone looking askance at you. We're allowed to hit someone you hate or possess someone you lust after. Those are good dreams, and that makes good melodrama. And alas, you're not allowed to do all that stuff in real life. So, but these actors were allowed to conduct these plot-saturated, disinhibited, saturated scenarios, and I don't know, we just had fun. So that was the installation part of it. It's really just a film shoot. But I had an installation at the Centre Pompidou for 3 weeks, another 3 weeks at the Phi Center. I called myself an installation artist and shot all this stuff. And then now I'm an internet artist because it's going to be all permuted and combined online. But I'm also a feature filmmaker, but I had to combine all these things, Frankenstein these things together for a feature.
I was fortunate enough to visit the Pompidou while Guy was shooting there, and I was kind of slightly alarmed for you in some ways because you were shooting in a very confined space.
Yeah, it was
way
way smaller than the
this
stage. Yeah.
And you had, a lot of people watching you do this.
Yeah.
So it's not like shooting a regular film where you're actually, in a private space, or the actors are in a private space. But you are quite exposed. Was that challenging for you?
It was kind of like I've heard participants on a reality show remark about how quickly they forget the camera's there. I quickly forgot that there were people watching, which kind of defeated the showmanship thing. But every now and then you'd look up and you'd see there's maybe 100 people watching, and sometimes only 3. If you were filming a close-up of a doorknob or something like that, the crowd dispersed in a hurry. There were 1 or 2 people that were alarmingly just watching my retinas the entire time, and I don't know who those people were. One of them was dressed in clown makeup and wouldn't go away. And a lot of people just came and went, but that's because it turns out that the cruisiest washroom in Paris was right next door, like literally just there. And that was the one that the actors and the crew members and I used, and I quickly discovered that was basically part of the installation. So, the shoots were you can't really tell how small the sets were, and nor do you get a sense of the people watching from close by, but and often the shooting was way more frenetic. I often talking over top, unless lines are being delivered. I'm often shouting directions to as many, to the person holding the fan, to the person holding a veil, to the person sprinkling rose petals or something like that, and to the actors, and trying, just quite often just saying things like again, or smaller, or again, or bigger, again with your chin up, again with your chin down, not so, turn to the left, the other left. No, the first left. Never mind. Just cut. I don't know, but just kind of ridiculous stuff. And but there was always kind of a crazy energy to them, and sometimes the artifice was. You could see people walking on the spot in front of a rear screen projection, but none of it's been color corrected, and I think that's what bothered me. Yet I was a little uncomfortable with making digital footage just in full color that hadn't been given a special look yet. So maybe that's why I didn't want to look. I was scared that the finished movie would look like these wonderful little dispatches from the front, So I was probably just scared. I didn't know what they would look like quite yet.
And how did you go about, it's an extraordinary cast that you've assembled over, you know, a number of different locations. How did you go about attracting people to the project, and were they sort of intimidated by what that might entail?
I was really honored. I went to Paris knowing I had the Centre Pompidou for 3 weeks in which to shoot, and that made me feel it was very flattering to get that gig. But I had spent the previous few months just friending every actor and actress on Facebook who lived in France, just figuring, man, I got to get my actors somewhere. But my Winnipeg-based producer had hired a line producer, just someone on the ground in Paris. And the first thing he did, even though there was no money in the budget for it, but it was because it was a smart thing to do, was get a casting director. And this is a guy, Alexander Nazarian. He really knows the Paris acting community. He knows everybody in it, and he knows which ones are up for a crazy-ass adventure and which ones would rather not. And so we didn't waste any of our time asking any of the people he thought would not. And but the names he was mentioning of people he thought would be up for it was incredible. And so just one at a time, I took them out for coffee and or lunch and explained the project all over again. And no one turned us down. So I got some really cool people I was just used to watching, like you do, in theaters, in movies. Mathieu Amalric, who I loved in so many. He's a Bond villain, for crying out loud, but he's also in The Diving Bell and The Butterfly and so many other movies. Charlotte Rampling, Adele Haenel, rising starlets like Adele Haenel and Ariane Labed. Udo Kier I brought. I knew him from before, and Geraldine Chaplin as well, but other people, people I'd really admired, and they'd been sort of faraway legends. Jacques Nolot, really strange, the maker of really strange and wonderful films, often with a kind of an AIDSy, confrontational, I don't know, it's just really astonishing people. And one after the other, they just said yes. The only person that turned us down was someone who didn't even meet us for lunch. Frederick Wiseman had been in Paris for a long time working on something, and I asked him, and he apparently said no. So got turned down by Frederick Wiseman.
He's not used to being in front of the camera.
No, I realized later he's notoriously uncomfortable with cameras and things, so I didn't take it too bad. And Michel Piccoli apparently said yes, but then there was a schedule issue, so it would have been nice to have him.
What's coming out here is a really interesting kind of sense of iteration. So this idea that your project is actually kind of hovering in this big kind of cloud,
yes,
and that you're somehow kind of pulling things down and anchoring them to different parts of the project. How do you map it in your own mind? Are you conscious of those parts as you're going, or is it that you make something and then you kind of see a place for it?
It's, I don't know, for some reason just the seance and seance is a movie metaphor just seems to work no matter what you do. Yeah. And it goes back to the very first time I ever went to Paris and just wanted to go see a movie, and noticed in the listings that movie times were called seances, because the word seance is just French for a seating. You maybe all know that here, but in North America we just think of seances as paranormal seatings, but they're the same thing really. The movie seance and the paranormal seance, it's a bunch of people coming to sit down, the lights go down, you're showing something that's not there, it's not really there, but you want to believe it's there, or a certain part of you wants to be enchanted into feeling a plausibility that's there. And then after it's over, the lights go on, and you decide among yourselves on the way home whether you were enchanted at all. And in each case, there's a fraud, a mountebank, a charlatan directing the whole thing. Either someone grubbing up a crystal ball with her fingerprints, or a director. They're charlatans anyway. They're just manipulating people and trying to get money out of them. Or trying to charm, trying to seduce them in some pathetic way. So the more, even just mentioning that there's a cloud up there, the internet and that things can come down, that there's some kind of other life or astral plane or some, I don't know, it all just seems to make sense. And the randomness of it, just when the signal from one lost film spirit weakens just enough, another one can come and interrupt it, and that the whole experience will just be experienced the way, I don't know, we've all seen old movies where someone sits down to have a seance to contact, say, a lost child or a lost lover, but Aunt Edna comes in first instead, and then the neighbor from across the street, and then an old house pet will bark a couple times, and then finally you see the person you're seeking, but something's not quite right. They're not, and the signal weakens and they disappear, and that's kind of what I was hoping to be for this seating. So it's just a matter of designing I'm no computer programmer, but designing a massive wireframe that's loaded up with all this fine cut footage we did that can then just randomize in ways that are pleasing. And so that we only shot 32 days, and so each one of those days is one lost film, but I started to mash up 3, 4, 7 films together, and then each one of those can be fragmented into, each day's worth of shooting ended up with about 20 minutes worth of fine cut stuff, fine cut to a certain score. But it's a massive Kuleshov experiment. Everything is a variable. The score will be different each time you encounter a film. The relationships between characters easily established through intertitles. Husband and wife can become brother and sister, or father and daughter, or rivals for the same lover, a third person. Their professions, the way will instantly change the way they relate to each other. The sound effects, certain MacGuffins can be swapped out. A prop, a crucial prop, a texture. Each film has been given a number of textures. There's a hard texture that is intercut. There's a little place for revolving textures. There's a hardness that comes in that will occur among all the films that appear together, or it'll be a gooiness, sort of a sperm shame texture. There'll be a softness, a cuddliness, a sharpness. There'll be different intertitles, different texts. No two sound effects will ever be the same. So it's quickly becomes infinite, and you can see why I can afford to lose the movies as quickly as they're made. But I'm hoping that the companion, this isn't answering your question, but that the two companions, the website and the feature film, which is locked in place, will complement each other and enrich each other sometime. In case any of you ever find yourself trapped watching The Forbidden Room a second time, maybe a brief dip into the internet might prove rewarding or awe. It would maybe at least be like a vivisection of filmmaking for you all.
And what stage is the building of that art?
It's almost finished.
Yeah.
It'll be ready in the first few months of 2016, and I don't know if anyone will care. I don't know I don't even understand the internet website world. I'm a real interloper there, but I do know I'm addicted to the internet, and I like watching movies. So, and I'm trying to design something that I'd like to watch. So I know right away but keep in mind, my favorite movie of the 21st century is Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. There's all sorts of things I like watching. And so maybe you'll like watching it too, or something. I don't know how many. At one time in my most megalomaniacal reveries, I feared addicting people to my website, but I realize I'll be lucky if someone comes and checks it out a couple times.
But I really also like the idea that you haven't spoken about in this, which is that you're also putting back into the hands of other people the opportunity to make something, make new films, make films that haven't previously existed. So while you're channeling films that have disappeared, you're doing that to make material that can then be released.
And they don't have to do much work either. It's mostly a binary operation. It shows and you watch, but there are some little things you can do to affect it. And but it's mostly watching, and if you're watching alone and by some amazing just pure chance, things sort of coalesce in a very pleasing way where themes suddenly appear and reappear and consolidate. Well, too bad you watched it alone and you can't share that with anyone. And I kind of like that. Those moments you have when you're out for a walk by yourself and something happens and you just, all you can do is impotently attempt to describe it. I don't know, I just like the idea of something happening that can't be shared.
So when you were working on the actual look of the Forbidden Room, and you touched on this a little bit when we looked at the credit sequence, but you're shooting in this context in the galleries or institutions in a way that's challenging for you in terms of, you know, you haven't got you're getting this raw material that isn't necessarily going to deliver what you're envisaging visually.
Yeah, it was depressing to me.
Step us through a little bit about what you then did to think about the visual elements.
Well, I watched a lot of, I mentioned this in the Q&A last night, I watched a lot of Technicolor movies just to see what was pleasing in color, because I'd been thinking in black and white for so long, which is, it's just easier. You know, there's difficulties in shooting black and white, but you don't have to think about the psychological meaning or psychological nudging that certain colors can produce. And you know, you really have to program a movie with its color from start to finish. All you have to do is think of Nicholas Roeg's Don't Look Now to know how important that little red raincoat is, and when the color red appears whenever, to know that you can't just put any old color up there without it taking on meaning. Same with Black Narcissus, where there's an orgy of off-whites and all those nuns' wimples. And so I started watching Douglas Sirk Technicolor movies because his palettes are really beautiful, and they do carry an emotion. They do some emotional work. It's sometimes subtle, and then they're delightful movies to watch because they're ridiculous melodramas with Rock Hudson in them, and and yet I find myself crying during them sometimes. So he's one of the few directors. Von Sternberg's another who can make even John Waters sometimes can make me cry and laugh simultaneously. And I'm not just crying for joy either. I'm moved. You know, I'm moved melodramatically. But then I'm laughing just with delight, because anything with Rock Hudson in Technicolor is delightful, or anything just with the score that Douglas Sirk uses, which is so overripe.
Dorothy Malone doing an extraordinary dance.
Yeah, Dorothy Malone dancing her father to death.
Exactly.
You know, it's delightful. And there's just so much delights. But then, so I didn't even really notice till I had to give a talk for $700 this summer. I needed the money badly, and I agreed to give a talk on Technicolor in Toronto that I watched carefully, and I tried to name the palettes that Sirk was using, and basically kept the same palette for each scene. And the palettes are quite complicated, and they work together really beautifully. And he used a lot of grays and blacks as well, but he also used, you know, some lemon chiffon and some aqua velva blue and this color that I came up with, Rock Hudson's nipple, you know, which is a beautiful color, sort of a smoky rose. And,
you could sell that to OP nail polish. They would
exactly.
Really go for
Well,
Rock
it reminded
Hudson's
me of
nipple.
nail polish names, or I'm an old house painter, so the paint chip colors. And I found it a really good exercise just to watch a movie and try to name all the colors in it, and it made me hyper aware of how much thought. And Sirk had been he described himself as a painter and a filmmaker, and he clearly put a lot of thought into it. So I realized I had to put that much thought into it too. But we'd already shot the movies, and just in raw color, and we didn't have much control over sets, and props had to be borrowed and cobbled together out of material whose colors we had no control over. So Evan and Galen, my co-director and my production designer, started manipulating the colors in post a lot until we got some palettes, and we wanted each story stratum to have its own palette. And some of them would be romantic and beautiful, and some of them would be intentionally butt ugly. You know, we wanted some of them to be kind of, there's one where the Sparks song about the final derriere is playing. Wanted it to remind people of a 70s porn film. You know, just kind of like a palette that had been scraped off a viewing booth floor, you know, or something like that. And and then others would be pleasing, and others would be faded, and I don't know, just to help people navigate their way through what was sure to be a very complex structure, if we could ever figure out how to put all these things together. So, and then we wanted, I really wanted, Evan encountered this kind of blobbing thing by using some software incorrectly, by abusing the software. And he experimented or accidentally chanced upon this effect. And it reminded me of what spiritualist photos taken in the 20s, which maybe you've all seen, where someone in a trance has some cheesecloth coming out of their nostrils, or some other orifice is producing some gloopy cotton batten or something. But they're always stills. They're never seen moving around. But they reminded me of what ectoplasm might look like moving around. And watching those Bill Morrison films like Decasia or Light is Calling, where you see when a film ages and is at the point where it can't be put through a projector anymore, but if it's digitally one frame at a time photographed and then animated, you can see the film is starting to buckle, and the images are starting to separate in different layers and boil and turn to powder and turn to goo. But mostly it's that buckling. It reminded me of what ectoplasm might look like if it was set in motion. And so I really like the fact that if film is the way we've been recording ghosts since photography was invented, and arguably it is, because the instant a photograph is taken of someone, that someone no longer exists, really. It's a someone who is exactly that many years, days, and seconds old, and now all of a sudden that record of someone locked in that exact age is separating from the real person. And so you're really looking at a photograph of a ghost every time you're looking at a photograph. And as the photograph gets older, it's literally a person who's now dead, and then as it gets older and older still, dead and forgotten, and then dead and if the spirit's lucky, mythic, not forgotten, but not really remembered, but just mythologized. And so the best medium for recording ghosts, really, you know, many mediums are good, writing, but is photography, because the instant the shutter is snapped, there's a ghost involved. And so it just seemed like the temporal decay of the medium itself would free the ghost from the emulsions. And so I don't know, I'm just making this stuff up as I'm talking to you, actually, but it just proves to me that the metaphor of the filmic and paranormal seance really does hold, no matter which way you add it up, sideways or vertically. Why did I shoot on digital instead of film? Money. And I had shot one feature on digital, and I needed to be pushed into it by economic constraints, but I really enjoyed shooting digitally, and it did give me the it just was a digital project. It was going on the internet, so, and I don't want to be a person perceived to be just stubbornly refusing to let go of film, staying in the past. The history of art is full of just all the artists moving forward in time's great flow, and occasionally looking back over the shoulder to acknowledge where we've all been, and then moving forward again. And I just didn't want to stay back there. I wanted to work with the media that the world has. And sure, I love film, fine, and but I don't know. I'm not stuck in some other era or anything. And it would have cost too much. And I also would have had to transfer it to digital anyway to do all the stuff I wanted to do and to get it up on the internet. So I just started with digital. But I could see why you'd ask me that. I asked myself that many times. We shot it on all sorts of different cameras too, and the Hara Mizumi was one of them. I've since lost it. I don't know where it is, and I miss it. Things got misplaced a lot on set because we shot so quickly, and especially when I brought in my own stuff, it wasn't part of an official department, and there wasn't an assistant to look after it. So I've lost so many cameras, but I did like the camera a lot. There were so many different formats, and some of them had really lousy sensors, and which I'd forgotten about until watching on IMAX, and then you realize, holy smokes, this tiny little sensor is being projected in IMAX, and it's really startling. You know, I know that the work I'm making now, I'm a slow learner, but if I live to be 150, I'll make a Mission Impossible movie, but it'll be a while. No, there was a practical motive for getting into the gallery space. For many years, people that didn't really like my movies maybe would try to think of something nice to say, and they'd say things like, well, geez, you could take any frame in your movies and, hang it in a gallery or something like that. And I started hanging out with a bunch of artists and holding collage parties, and I really enjoyed them. And I thought at one point I could make a script whose origins weren't in the written word, but were in the image. And I thought that maybe if I used fewer words, especially spoken words, in a movie, it might be more pleasing. So I held, in 3 different countries, 10 collage parties with maybe 10 pretty good artists. And I would supply all these books, old books to cut up, and old porn magazines, and I would take their collages and try to take my favorite ones and try to think of a script out of it. And my last feature film before Forbidden Room Keyhole started that way, and a script slowly started forming just from images. And this was this idealistic way, and a lot of these collage parties were held in galleries, including one at La Maison Rouge in Paris, and another one at Creative Growth in Oakland. And I liked working in the gallery, and then I became friends with some of the curators at the Centre Pompidou after I had a retrospective there, and I just thought, and around that time a bunch of the collages were hanging in the Maison Rouge in Paris, and they sold, and I made a bit of money, and that felt really good. And I'd been invited a few times to make installations, but I felt I didn't understand installation art well enough to go into it without. It was enough that I didn't understand movies very much, but I'm making them. But to go and start making installations when I didn't know installation history that well. But I did think of if at least I could maybe get my foot in the door by making an installation in which I'm just making a movie in public. I thought of the metaphor at first of an ant farm, the way when you're a little kid, you get 2 panes of glass with a bunch of ants making a colony in there. And I thought, I was even thinking of calling the installation Ant Farm or something like that. But it was kind of there was a practical motive, and I thought if the day comes when I can't make movies, maybe I'll have an installation life, and I'll have to learn it. Maybe I'll have to learn it from the inside even. So it was a kind of a force. I was forcing myself into that world, and I do understand it a bit better now, and I've even made a couple of things that weren't just movie shoots in public. They were installations that I'm proud of, and I'm learning slowly. But I don't know if that's answering the question. It's strange. I think it was Jim Hoberman, the writer, long-time writer for The Village Voice, who described me as the most commercial experimental filmmaker and the most experimental commercial filmmaker, or the queerest straight filmmaker or the straightest gay filmmaker or whatever it was. But I am sort of in between often, or seen that way. I think one of my films even got programmed into films of the Third Reich at one point. I don't know how. So, at a Goethe Institute somewhere. I was both honored and a little bit alarmed.
Which one?
Careful. I made a Berg film, a mountain melodrama, and so it was tacked on as a kind of a post-Nazi. Well, the Berg film is not a Nazi film. It's a German genre, but anyway. But you could throw that film into a LGBT film festival just as well too. So anyway. Now I'm just bluffing instead of riffing. Sorry. I don't know. It did have its practical. It was never money, but it was some sort of just seeing if I could test out some other territories and see what happened. And I feel a little more comfortable in it now, to the point where I could tell if an idea I have is bullshit or not. So I feel a little better. But I would not call myself a great installation artist yet or anything. We just made some films in public. Yeah, my co-director and his brother, Galen and Evan Johnson, really, they know computers way better than I do. Evan and I co-wrote the stuff, and Evan and I were closer together on set than Claire and I are now. And so he gets a co-director credit because we were really just two hemispheres of the same diseased brain. And but we each had our respective hemispheres, each had our strengths. And I just, in all good conscience, could not call him anything but a co-director. I realized later, even there, I should have just called him a director and myself a director, because the way it goes is I'm a director and he's a co-director in some weird left-handed way. But he handles all the digital post effects. With my approval, of course, because we're collaborators and we have a wonderful relationship. But he just cooks the pixels and then runs some palettes by me, and we agree that the overall trajectory of things should be this way. And some of the movies have completely different looks in other versions, but that's okay because anything goes, because it all just gets loaded up into the website. So if you watch F.W. Murnau's Duryanuskov, which I had adapted as a black and white film, you can see it in other color combinations and with other plots and everything like that. So there were no rejected palettes. They were just sort of slid onto the website, which is more like a landfill site now, I guess, full of like rejected pixels. But many of them are beloved as well. Don't get me wrong. Maybe we're out of time. I'm not sure. But even I know the website will have far more digital artifacting on it because it is a website. It'll still have its nods to film, and most of the source material comes from film, the film world, the film graveyard.
Well, Guy, I'm fairly compelled, I don't know how you feel about this, to maybe wrap up with a little reflection on where you feel this has kind of landed you in terms of, I don't know, perhaps this is going to go far too deep for a,
No, I can tailor.
Where has it landed you in terms of how you see your next project? Where would your next project be, given that in some ways I could see this becoming an endless project?
It's endless. I had to just quit. I really was heartbroken when the MoMA portion of it fell through, but I was also relieved because it meant probably another 2 years worth of work of editing and everything. And I'd lived with the project already for many years, and it was an endless project. And it was mad to start. And I didn't have a producer. My first producer was very inexperienced and kind of hid her fear by just not admitting it. And so when I said I want to shoot 100 films in 100 days, when there's no way I could find money for it in different countries we didn't have co-productions agreements with, instead of her going, well, that might be a problem, she just wrote the number 100 down on a piece of paper. And so I needed someone to just scare the shit out of me at the beginning, but no one did, and I just went, okay, 100. Why didn't I ask for 400, or something? But it's done. I have to walk away from it, although I really do want to shoot Never the Twain with 100 naked women slaughtering patriarchy. But so I'm walking away from it, I think, and like I've said many times, making a movie for me is always something that's born out of an obsession, and just the hard work and the time spent on making that usually cures me of the obsession. I'm usually sick of that obsession, and it's no longer an obsession. So I am cured. And
I feel like you're a psychiatrist.
I'm thoroughly cured. Yes, thank you. I'll just lie down. I'm thoroughly cured. Thank you, Claire. You won't be getting a monthly check from me anymore. No, I really enjoyed I made a short film. It was mostly Evan and Galen that made it. We were each co-directors, but I really liked where it went. It's cine-essay, kind of a fictional documentary mashup, whatever. All documentaries are fictional anyway. It's just kind of an extension of the Chris Marker career. My favorite Chris Marker movie is actually Ed Wood's Glen or Glenda. I love that cine-essay, which is highly personal, where Ed Wood, acting under a different name, is portraying himself as a person who likes to cross-dress. Then the sensationalist in him cross-cut that story with the Christine Jurgensen's gender reassignment surgery. And then at his producer's behest, he had to include some burlesque footage of strippers. And it's just this kind of thing that drew on so many different sources, but ended up being put together with spit and old Scotch tape and Bela Lugosi monologues, poorly remembered ones, and some stock footage of bison stampeding. And the whole thing is actually so beautiful and so personal that the first few times I watched it, I was experiencing ripples of goose flesh of delight, and maybe some identification with what it's like having no budget and not quite knowing what you're doing. But now I'm at the point where I'm weeping when I'm watching it. And it's that thing where I can laugh and cry at the same time, which is really the ultimate goal for me, but it should be the ultimate goal of all sorts of artists. And so I'd like to keep working in some sort of new form of cine-essay or something. I made the one I never finished my sentence about is called Bring Me the Head of Tim Horton. We did a making of together. We went to Jordan last October, so I shot an all digital, all color, all contemporary on the set of a Canadian war movie called Hyena Road in Jordan. And I just started riffing on stuff, and it was very satisfying. The director of Hyena Road perennially gets way bigger budgets than I do, and so I just started a self-pitying monologue about how jealous I was of his budgets, and out of that spun the entire movie. I really was playing a version of myself, because Canadian big budgets are still, by Hollywood standards, small budgets, but we played characters where we hated each other, but it was convincing enough. By the end of the project, we actually did hate each other. the two directors, the one with the big budget and the little one. No, and we'll be fine eventually, I'm sure. No, we like each other. I'm just joking. But I really got hooked on the making of thing, and I started watching other making ofs. And it's what a great opportunity to just cover almost any subject. I'm a big fan of Per This is just on YouTube. Quadachuk Vampire by Per Portabella. It's the making of a Jesse Franco movie with Christopher Lee and Soledad Miranda called Count Dracula, 1970. Just this making of is amazing. The guy, Portabella, just put his camera next to Franco's, stole his actors, stole his costumes, stole his script, and just made his own movie, but in black and white instead of in color. And he dropped the soundtrack and added his own experimental soundscape, and it's really dreamy and beautiful and strange. And by coincidence and genius, it's an allegorical condemnation of the dictator Franco, and it's a masterpiece. Our movie, Bring Me the Head of Tim Hortons, no such masterpiece, but it was it represents to me a genre with so much potential. And so I'll go on public record here as saying I know Christopher Nolan is making a big feature next summer, and I really want to be on set to shoot the making of. I'm here through you, channeling through you, Claire, an appeal to Christopher Nolan. And I know the brothers Quay very well, and I had lunch with them today, and I'm working through them too. Maybe I should just contact Christopher Nolan's representatives and ask him if I can do a making of, but I really want to. So that's my next project.